The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law.
I fall for law, the law one. I fall for law, the law one. I need him.
Hey, and welcome to the show. I'm Zach Spencer. This is The Law Show on CL 650. Today we're focusing on the anatomy of brain injury. And with us in studio, Joe Murphy, QC lawyer, partner MurphyBattista in Vancouver, right downtown. And he's brought in a special guest, Liz Barron, secretary of the BC Brain Injury Association. Joe, I'll start with you. You brought Liz in to talk about brain injury, a specialist in this. So this is a passion of yours, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, Zach. I first started working with people in the early 80s with brain injuries, and for me it was a real learning curve. At that time, there wasn't a lot of medical knowledge about brain injuries unless a person was sort of left in a coma, and then everyone understood it. And what I learned over time is the more I can understand about how a client functions and how they function differently after brain injury, the more I can understand how the brain injuries impacted them. And it's not functioning in a doctor's office. It's not functioning sometimes on a test. It's functioning in day-to-day world. And there's just some red flags that I've grown to understand or realize that you look for with a brain injury when I'm trying to understand how the person is different.
Mm-hmm. And are you seeing this a lot from vehicle accidents? There's a high percentage of brain injuries because of that, or all kinds of different work-related items?
Tragically, there's a whole bunch of different ways, Zach, you can have a brain injury. You can have a brain injury when you hit your head. You can have a brain injury when you don't hit your head, but you hit your body on something. You can have a brain injury. I had one client who suffered a terrible leg injury in an accident, and the femoral artery poured so much blood out at the scene that she suffered a brain injury from the lack of oxygen to the brain because of this huge blood loss. You can suffer a brain injury that's what's called diffuse, which means your whole brain is affected. Or you can have a brain injury that's called focal, which means it's one point. Gunshot wounds are mostly focal injuries, but fortunately in Canada we don't have to deal with that. Mm-hmm. But tragically, there's just so many different ways you can do it in sports. You can do it in, a good example in sports, synchronized swimming.
Really?
Has a very high incidence of concussion or brain injury.
How would that be?
Synchronized swimming is a team, and the way they work, and I didn't realize this first, I thought it was like ballet in water.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
The bigger swimmers are underneath the water, and their job is to lift the little swimmers out of the water at the appointed time. And the little swimmers are there treading water, and it's very, very common for the little swimmer treading water to kick one of the swimmers underneath them in the head.
Really?
And there's no head protection. And I know this from a family member of mine, a young girl who was put into it, loved it, thrived on it, and ended up with a series of bad concussions, and she's now struggling with the effects of that. So for her, that has been, to date, a life-altering series of injuries, and it was her parents who were just looking for some good team sport to put her into when she was 12 or 13. So it can happen in so many different ways. It can happen in a playground setting. I have clients in rear-end collisions that appear pretty modest, but suddenly their life is changed and they function so differently. And these are people, successful, well-motivated people who want to simply carry on with their lives, professionals, and suddenly, as I say, after what appears to be a fairly modest accident, things are different. So I look at how things are different and sort of work backwards, because the actual concussion, it can be fairly slight. You don't need to be knocked out. Generally, you need to be sort of stunned by an accident. Sometimes people forget things. Their memory is erased after the event. Sometimes it's erased before the event. But it's difficult sometimes to get people to realize that there are things they don't remember. You know, I say to them, how's your memory? Oh, I remember everything. And then you start asking them detailed questions. Do you remember when the ambulance arrived? Well, no. Do you remember getting loaded onto the stretcher? Well, no. So it's a matter of just searching and asking the right questions, and for the lawyer listening.
All right, we want to introduce the guest you brought with you today, Liz Barron, Secretary of the BC Brain Injury Association. Now, I'm not going to go through your resume here because it's extensive, so you can gloat a little bit and tell us your background and what you've done and been able to accomplish and what your specialty is.
Well, thanks for having me. I have worked as a speech pathologist for about 20 years now, and my practice has always been in the area of brain injury. I hit that in my externship of graduate school, and it became my passion from there. I've had the opportunity to work in brain injury from the very beginning, the neuro ICU, when clients come through the door after an emergency. And I worked for probably the first half of my career in acute care. And I think, that's an area that we've come a long way, and there's no doubt in terms of how we treat our clients living with brain injuries in hospital and mending them and repairing them as best we can. And then where I moved in my career into community was the next phase of that recovery. So sometimes I think we front load our system really well. We rush in immediately after the injury. We've got a lot of healthcare providers around the clients and lots of support. They're often in hospital for months, some of these folks. And what I found was when they're discharged from hospital, there isn't always as much available to them. So moving into community was really interesting for me because that immediate time after the accident is just a very small piece of their journey.
Well, from what Joe's saying, it can be lifelong, right?
Absolutely. And I think, we often aren't aware of how difficult that can be, when people need to piece their life back together. They're often unable to return to the job that they had prior to their injury. It changes roles and relationships in families. There's often mood and personality changes that can affect a mental health component. Addictions becomes a very interrelated issue with brain injury in many cases, and all of that ties into social issues like housing and support and income and those things.
It's a big onion, right? You just keep peeling back.
It's a huge onion. So I've become more interested in the second half of my career in working with clients in the community and helping them basically reshape their lives and get a new life back. It really is defining yourself after injury and helping them figure out where to go from here. And I think we're doing a good job in BC of looking at that and beginning to change that in terms of how we provide supports and services in the community. But I'm hopeful that we can still have a long way to go.
I was going to ask, in your opinion, expert opinion, how does British Columbia stack up across the country when it comes to supporting people with brain injuries?
In my experience, as I was suggesting and what I was saying earlier, I think we do a really good job early in a person's injury, and I think we're seeing a lot of positive change in how we support people in the community in recent years. That being said, if you look at a province like Ontario, we've still got a long way to go in terms of, the kinds of supports that we put available to these clients, not just in terms of rehab. I think people tend to just go to that medical model all the time. Do you have an OT or do you have a physiotherapist? But really looking at the broader picture and being able to support these clients in terms of having purpose in their day-to-day lives and a place to go and even, a place to live. Like the housing and care component is really, really important because if you don't have a place to live, it's very difficult to start building a life. So I'm optimistic about where BC is going, and I think that's very much part of what we're hoping to be a part of shaping in terms of a provincial strategy at the BC Brain Injury Association. But when you look at other provinces like Ontario, I see that we still have a long way to go, and I'm hopeful that we can move in that direction.
This sounds to me like it's expensive, very expensive, to look after people for the rest of their lives. Now, Joe, that's where insurance obviously comes into to play. If you're involved in an accident and you have an insurance component, now obviously sometimes you have nothing. You could be playing sports, as you mentioned. So with your expertise on the law side, that's a huge part of your business, I guess, getting the amount of money that it's going to take to look after this person for the long run.
Well, yeah, the short answer is yes. The problem, Zach, is when you finish a case, whether you go to court or settle, you have to try and predict what the person's lifelong needs are in terms of care. And when you get a person who's fairly young, the challenge of doing that, it can be great. We finished a case recently for a 19-year-old girl injured at the age of 8 in a car accident, and the issue was what care help would she need as a parent?
Right.
This was a girl who I think was likely to have 2 children, looking in my crystal ball, was likely not to be in a stable long-term relationship because she had so many problems sort of dealing socially with the world, but she was very loving and I think would treasure the idea of having her own children. This is part of being normal. So just that part alone, how much help is she going to need? New mothers often get help from someone, whether it's their mother, the family, whatever, to get over that initial stage so they don't get too exhausted. People with brain injuries tire very, very, very quickly. So the ability of an average new mother to cope with the demands of a child is far different than the needs of this woman. Emotionally, as the child gets older, maybe into their teens, there's the need to deal with the emotional side of it. And a person with a brain injury has real problems doing that because their ability to understand people, their ability to communicate, to deal with challenges is so far reduced. So just the care alone, the issue of parenting can be a real challenge.
We're talking today about the anatomy of brain injury. In studio, Joe Murphy, lawyer, a partner at MurphyBattista in downtown Vancouver. Special guest today is Liz Barron, the secretary of the BC Brain Injury Association. We're on The Law Show. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the understanding of traumatic brain injury, how it's become more top of mind for a lot of people because of sports. And this is Super Bowl Sunday. So we'll continue that next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.